Hello and welcome everybody to our second installment in which we visit some of the sites seen by Captain Francisco de Cuellar during the course of his adventures here in Ireland, brought on by his participation in the ill-fated Spanish Armada of 1588. In the previous episode, we talked about the circumstances which led to de Cuellar being shipwrecked off Streedger Point near the then garrisoned village of Grange, some of the mixed interactions he had with the locals, as well as the destruction scene as he fled the monastic site now known locally as Stad Abbey. Interestingly, there may have been another monastic site just east of Grange, near the modern graveyard of a hamlet, with some historians thinking that this may have been in fact the site referenced by de Cuellar. With the images of his fellow Spanish hanging from the windows of that burnt-out church by a stormy Atlantic coast still fresh in his mind, de Cuellar made his way into some thick woodland nearby. He hoped to find food and shelter there, but coming to no avail, he returned to the shoreline in order to find the provisions he needed. But besides the flotsam from the fleet, he found the beaches strewn with hundreds of his compatriots, with the local inhabitants stripping what they could from them. Among those formerly from the fleet, de Cuellar recognised two of the bodies as friends. These two, having a greater emotional impact on de Cuellar, he gave them a quick burial in the sands, with prayers and platitudes, before being joined by two other surviving Spanish. Shortly hereafter, they were joined by a friendly local savage, as de Cuellar refers to the local Irish, who gave them directions on through Grange, through Glencar, to where the O'Rourke's would hopefully give them refuge. De Cuellar wrote about being robbed by some of the less than friendly locals he'd encountered when trying to sneak around Grange, unseen by the castle and those occupying it. He wrote about the gold chain they'd pulled from his neck, the coins which were the 2 months' wages he'd been given in Lisbon before sailing, and that he'd stitched into the lining of his shirt. They took it all, leaving de Cuellar cold, mostly naked, wounded and famished. Stitching coins into the lining of the jacket or shirt they'd wear on campaign was a common practice among the young officers at the time. This was supposed to help them in case they became lost or separated from the rest of their men, so they'd still be able to buy food, shelter, directions, potentially even pay for their own ransom should they be captured. These coins were supposed to help their wearers survive, but instead had been the end of so many of them, making them a target for those on shore, or becoming like a lead life jacket, dragging those it was supposed to aid under the waves to perish. De Cuellar, writing about these robbing rogues, rough in both appearance and manner, said they would have outright killed him if it weren't for a beautiful local Irish woman who interceded on his behalf, convincing these rogues to leave with the spoils they'd already gotten. After this, she gave him some milk and oat bread with butter while attending to his various injuries. Feeling much better, de Cuellar continued on his journey towards the stronghold of the O'Rourke's, travelling through Glenade Valley and meeting other Spanish survivors along the way. But alas, when they got to their destination, they were informed that the O'Rourke's, as well as their attendees, had already fled up into the mountains, as they were currently in a protracted conflict with the English, who were then occupying the nearby town of Sligo and its surrounding areas. Now at this location, on the northern shores of Lough Gill, presently stands Parke's Castle, built in the 1620s to replace the O'Rourke stronghold that had previously been there. The site as we see it now had its restoration and conservation work begin in the early 1980s, shortly after several seasons of archaeological excavations which took place between 1970 and 1977, with the site now being under the care of the OPW, Office of Public Works. Parke's Castle is one of many plantation-era fortified manor houses built in the early 17th century, and as such shares many similar features. This beautiful example is comprised of its 1. A gatehouse, which was most likely built at the same time as the manor house and was done to help strengthen the main entrance from attack by providing a second gate with murder holes between the two gates. 2. A manor house, built probably using recycled stone and materials from previous structures at the site, was done as part of the plantation contract and to provide his family with a more comfortable home, of course. 3. Two round corner towers. These were used to create flanking fire on anyone at the outside base of the wall, and are located on the northern corners of the bawn, and may have been part of the defences before, and then modified by the Parks during their works here. 4. Sallyport. A discreet small entrance in the curtain wall for various purposes. It is located through the base batter of the eastern end of the lock side wall. Bawn. The courtyard in the centre of the site, which was cobbled by the Parks, but had been bare sod beforehand. 6. The curtain wall. This is mostly from the original castle, and as it stands now is about 5 metres tall, although the Parks modified it to add another metre or two along the tops of these walls. 7. The bartizans. On the corners of the lockside section of wall, they appear to have been constructed at the same time as the wall's height was increased. These structures would have helped give a sentry on duty a wider field of vision, as well as provide some shelter from our sometimes wild Atlantic weather. 8. The moat. This ditch would have surrounded the curtain wall and was about 2 metres deep and 8 metres wide, cut directly into the rock. It is from this ditch that the majority of the stone used for the construction of the curtain wall most likely came from. Captain Robert Parke, from where this site currently gets its name, was a prominent English businessman with strong political and possible family ties to Sir Roger Jones, the man who was appointed Constable of Sligo Castle in 1606, and thus might explain how Newtown and the surrounding areas came into possession of the Parke family. Previously, the O'Rourkes had been the lords of this land, though not without different sporadic conflicts and political upheavals. But this all changed with a cunning plan from the Crown in 1620. For years, the Crown wished to take possession of these properties, having surveys done tallying the defences in the area. But then, in 1620, the Crown had an opportunity through a jury verdict which said that the then Brian O'Rourke, as well as his brothers, were all illegitimate due to the fact that his mother had been previously married, and the court retroactively imposing that the matter had not been fully concluded. This meant, among other things, that the land reverted to the Crown, who immediately implemented a plantation scheme. The first two would-be planters were Scottish, although they didn't last long, as neither had made sufficient attempt to build the required infrastructure as cited by the documents that they had signed. By 1627, Robert was in possession of Newtown, and shortly after was in compliance with the contract signed by beginning the construction of their residence, the fortified Elizabethan manor house, which we still see here today. This property had several spits of work done and then passed into the hands of the famous Gore family, but didn't last long as a residence for them, and was soon out of use by the early 1700s. Another interesting, yet little known fact about the site is that the popular Irish Celtic folk rock group Horselips recorded their version of the traditional Irish folk tune King of the Fairies during the 1970s in the banquet hall here at Parke's Castle. This was probably only made possible due to two of the members from Horselips having worked for the OPW as guides in Parke's Castle. But as revealed by the 1970s excavations, when the foundations of an earlier tower house were found here, just under the sod in the centre of the bawn. This is what remains of the structure that Captain Francisco de Cuellar and his fellow survivors would have seen as they passed through Glencar Valley to the shores of Lough Gill. In 1588, a medieval tower house with its bawn, wall and surrounding moat stood here, instead of the Parks family manor house. Although it can be seen that the curtain wall, the moat, as well as some other features were kept and repurposed by the Parke family. Structures like these, and others similar, are commonly depicted in pop culture as they can be seen now, having bare stone walls, when in fact, these buildings would have had various renders applied to them, depending on their geographical location. These tower houses would have most likely had a lime plaster and whitewash, a method commonly used on domestic buildings in the region well up until the 20th century, with one traveller of the era saying of these tower houses that they appear emerging from the landscape like dragon's teeth. While not fully known, there are a few theories of when and by who this tower house was built. Leading theory is Newtown Castle may have been built in the early 1220s, being one of 3 built by William Gorham de Lacy for use of his half-brother Philip the Anglo. Although in 1226 the King of Connaught appealed to Henry III, who sent the son of the infamous William Marshal, also named William Marshal, to Ireland to restore some of these properties to their Gaelic lords. It is in 1546 that we have the first known accounts mentioning this tower house, although there is confusion as there is another tower house less than a kilometre east called Duroy Castle, from the Gaelic Dovrath, meaning Blackford, which also stands on the shores of Lough Gill. These tower houses would have helped guard the mouth of the Bonnet River into the loch, with some local historians theorising that this was done in part to control trade in the area, in particular in cattle, with large contemporary cattle enclosures only another kilometre or 2 up the valley. These accounts come from the annals of Lough Key and are scant in detail. These accounts mention Newtown in 1581, 7 years before our story begins, saying that Brian O'Rourke dismantled this and another tower house in Dromahair so that the English could not use them. But these structures are then mentioned in the following years, so it was uncertain to the accuracy of these accounts. In Captain de Cuellar's writings, he mentions that the O'Rourkes had already gone, but does not describe the tower house, nor the state it was in. A little known fact about this second tower house in Castletown is that it was the site of the first known recorded use of, and death by, firearms in Ireland. Interestingly, it was a different Brian O'Rourke that the Annals of the Four Masters in 1487 record his death as by the shot of a ball. By 1590, the English crown had had enough of the conflict with the O'Rourkes, and so moved on their territory. This fresh aggression made Brian O'Rourke flee to Scotland, where he'd hoped to find safe harbour and help, but instead was promptly handed over to the crown and put in the Tower of London. It was here he stayed until he was later hung, drawn and quartered in 1591. After the disappointment at Newtown, de Cuellar and his company were then told of a Spanish ship that was possibly anchored just offshore from Streedger Strand, where de Cuellar had first washed ashore, and the ship was waiting for any survivors to make themselves known and to be brought aboard. At this point, numbering 20 or more, de Cuellar and his compatriots made their way with most haste to the shore in order to try and meet up with this ship, but de Cuellar, with his injured leg, was unable to keep pace with the rest of the group and was soon left behind. The ship set sail without him, but this turned out to be a stroke of good fortune for de Cuellar, as not 2 days later, that same ship was wrecked further down the coast, taking with her another 200 lives. This, in one sense, may have been a stroke of good luck for de Cuellar, but yet again it left him in a strange land of strange sights, struggling for survival. Thank you for watching, and please do join us again in the next episode, where we join de Cuellar as he makes his way to the scenic site of Rosclahar Castle. Please do leave your likes and comments below, and see you in the next one.